It's time now for Perspective. This Tuesday, following a long campaign by her admirers here in France, Josephine Baker will enter the final resting place of the great and good of French history, the Panthéon in central Paris. The Missouri-born dancer made her mark in the cabarets of Paris in the 1920s. She later went on to work in the French resistance during World War II and also made her mark in the US civil rights movement. My guest today is Ilana Navaro, director of a documentary called Josephine Baker, The Story of an Awakening. Thank you so much for speaking to us on France 24 today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolute pleasure. So, of course, Josephine Baker went on to become a huge star, we know that, but her beginnings were much more humble. She was born in Missouri, in a segregated America. Can you tell us a little bit more about her early years?
Well, Josephine is a perfect Cinderella story. She actually comes from a very poor background from Missouri, where she had only the opportunity to dance for segregated America, and from one day to the next, she is invited to Paris as a dancer, and all of a sudden she becomes the muse of all the Parisians. It's really a great story to tell, which is what we try to do. We took like three years to make the documentary that you can watch on arte.tv.
And we see some footage behind us, but your documentary includes an extraordinary range of footage from the 20s and 30s especially. Some footage that's quite difficult to watch. You see Josephine Baker engaging in quite a few what we would consider now racist stereotypes. Is that something that you expect viewers to see, that kind of uncomfortable historic side?
Yes. To look at Josephine is really to be able to confront all of the racism of European and American society. Josephine came to France because she already, well, maybe I should first talk about the dance, I don't know, yes, let's say Josephine became famous in France through her scandalous dance. Sometimes she was bare-chested. She's also known for the banana skirt that she wore. She probably was obliged to do these dances. That's what we hear, but she sort of complied with it. She took what was given to her, and at that moment, it was the peak of the French colonial empire. The French weren't ready to look at, the French wanted a black dancer to embody this kind of images. And Josephine took what she had and later on turned it into a political tool. That's the story we tell. It takes a long time, but in fact, yes, she definitely embodies this racist imagery. She turns it around later on to embody also something very modern. That is, as she makes it that the savage dance become a modernity that is desirable. In the 1920s, people are still in their in the old European traditions, in a very conservative society. People see some sort of a freedom in the way that she dances and want to be like her. And it's a very sort of dérangeant in France, we say.
Unsettling, maybe.
Unsettling to see her nowadays, probably at the time also, but people didn't necessarily have the jargon to talk about it at the time. But yes, that's the story we're telling.
And let's talk for a second about her time as a member of the French resistance. How did she come to join an underground organisation resisting Nazi rule in occupied France?
Josephine was a real star. I mean, she was the most photographed woman of her time. She was, she knew a lot of people. She had Picasso talked about her as the Nefertiti of her time. She was friends with Le Corbusier, who is a very famous French architect. She had a bar in Paris. She knew a lot of people, and she was invited everywhere. So when she realized that France, which was her country of adoption, which had obviously was at a much better place to give her as compared to where she was coming from, which was segregated America. She thought that she could give anything. She could give her life to France. That's how she felt. That's how she talks about it. But it comes from deceptions, many deceptions with her country of origin. In fact, Josephine's real issues were with her own country. With
disappointments.
Her disappointments with her own country. And probably the reason why she joined with all this fervor the French resistance was in a reaction to the way she was treated in her own country.
And she did eventually go on to become a leading figure in the Black civil rights movement in the US, but only after some time.
Yes, that's much later on. She had a very long life, and she is inspiring also for that, because she had the chance to change from becoming a very famous dancer, an icon, to become a hero of the French resistance, and later on she became a civil rights activist. Yes.
And throughout your film, we hear Josephine Baker's voice herself, which is a very intimate way of getting into what we imagine was her mind at the time. Why did you decide to make that artistic call?
Well, we found out that Josephine had written her story many, many times since the beginnings of when she came to Paris in the 1920. She came to Paris in 1925, and 2 years later, she already had started to talk about her own experience as coming to France, why she came to France, why France was a place of freedom for her, etc. She started to talk about that, and her initial accounts, her initial stories were very fresh. You could really hear her. She probably didn't speak French that well, so she co-wrote her story with a French writer. But there was something very fresh in the way she realized that people were really watching her as some sort of a strange thing. And she was realizing that she was being looked at, but she also looked at this French society, which was very racist at the time, even though nothing comparable to the United States, but still. So not just France, but all of Europe. We found this amazing footage of her travels through Europe, and at some point she goes to Netherlands, and she dresses up in a street show as a Dutch peasant with a big hair, with a big hat and how do you call them, sabots?
Clogs, maybe.
Clogs, and she does her Charleston dance. On the street, and people look at her. They've never seen such a thing in her life, and she's a star. And it's almost like she's like, when we look at those Dutch peasants, we almost think of them as savages. You don't know who is the savage in this case.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We are running out of time, but it really is an extraordinary documentary full of amazing footage. I really do recommend you see it if you can, especially now as Josephine Baker is about to enter the Pantheon in central Paris. Ilana Navaro, director of Josephine Baker, The Story of an Awakening. Thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you.